Can you believe that the woman is already 60 years old? Her special care secret can make women youthful and men rejuvenated. She took out a bowl of something similar to soft candy, cut ginger into large pieces, put them into the bowl filled with water and carefully added the soft candy. She picked on, up and put it in her mouth, enjoying it with a smile on her face. But at first glance, there are blood vessels and even little tails in this soft candy. The woman is called Auntie May, and she runs a private dumpling shop. Despite having the face of a 20-year-old, she always calls herself an old lady. Auntie May always carries a food box, and frequents the obstetrics and gynecology hospital. She collects formed stillborn fetuses with a layer of chicken egg rice on top to easily deceive security. Auntie May used to be a famous specialist doctor in the hospital. After suffering from emotional trauma, Auntie May understood that a woman's most valuable asset is her face. Men like 20-year-old women when they are 30, and they still like 20-year-old women when they are 40, 50, or 60 years old. Auntie May studied medicine but went down the wrong path. According to ancient books, human bone marrow, flesh, and blood can all be used as medicine in ancient times. A minister cooked his own son and sent it to the emperor to please him. One day, a special guest arrived at Auntie May's house. Mrs. Lee, a Hong Kong female star, who rose to fame in the entertainment industry, and then married a wealthy man and retired. Once a woman has no career, all her reliance comes from her husband, but he frequently betrays her. Finding Auntie May is Mrs. Lee's last resort. Auntie May is the live advertisement for the dumplings. With her face like the goddess, Auntie May can swear that although the dumplings are expensive, they are definitely worth the money. Auntie May's techniques are skilled, and in no time, dumplings worth tens of thousands of dollars are ready. Mrs. Lee picked one up and put it in her mouth, but a pungent Auntie smell hit her nose. She took a bite but couldn't help but spit it out. Even dogs wouldn't eat it. Auntie May picked it up, washed it, and buried it in the flowers and plants, saying, "Women are just like flowers." After eating the dumplings, Mrs. Lee's skin became visibly fairer and more vibrant. But she still felt it was not enough, because this slight change was not enough to make her husband change his mind. She asked Auntie May if there was a faster and more effective solution. When asked about professional knowledge, Aunt May became excited and told Mrs. Lee that the most beautiful embryos are those of 5-6 months old fetuses, which can be extracted using amniocentesis. They are wrapped in a layer of creamy fetal fluid with clear colors, and even the skull and limbs have formed. So the best option is the 5-month-old ones. Even an 80-year-old can feel like 18 years old after eating them. Mrs. Lee was very interested, and said she wanted to purchase them, but Aunt May said she would try her best because these precious items are hard to come by. The opportunity came not long after. An evil father made his 14-year-old daughter pregnant. The mother, full of grief and anger, brought her 5-month pregnant daughter to Aunt May for help. After examining the girl, Aunt May refused the mother's request, stating that the 5-month-old fetus had already developed roots and that forcibly aborting it would be very dangerous as the bones could puncture the uterus. The mother was thrown into a panic, but still pleaded with Aunt May to terminate the pregnancy, as she didn't know whether to call the child her daughter or granddaughter if it was born. The girl remained silent, keeping her head down, seemingly unwilling to face any of it. In the end, Aunt May performed the induced labor for the girl, which lasted for 18 hours. When she looked at the formed embryo in her hand, she couldn't help but sigh at how fresh it was, then hummed a song and put it in the refrigerator. On the other side, Mrs. Lee caught her husband being intimate with a massage girl. Mr. Lee joked and used the girl's legs to crack an egg. Mr. Lee opened the egg and inside was a formed little chicken. He ate it without any hesitation because otherwise he wouldn't be able to perform well that night. Mr. Lee was playing around without realizing that everything was being watched by his wife. Apparently, her own transformation was not enough. She found Aunt May again, and the so-called precious goods had already been found. The sound of chopping meat was constantly coming from next door, disturbing everyone's peace. Mrs. Lee couldn't help but take a peek and walked behind the curtain, where she saw Aunt May taking out a baby from the refrigerator. Its hands and feet had even fully formed. Mrs. Lee's pupils dilated instantly and she shouted and fled. Even though she had known that she was eating fetuses, seeing it in person made her feel nauseous. Aunt May saw Mrs. Lee run away, but she didn't lose heart. She just waited quietly for her to come back. Sure enough, Mrs. Lee returned to the small attic within a few minutes. After she calmed down, she suddenly accepted everything with pleasure. One should not dwell on the cause, but focus on the consequences. Aunt May excitedly discussed with Mrs. Lee that this was a baby boy from a student, which means healthy and clean. Mrs. Lee asked Aunt May to quickly make a basket of dumplings, which Mrs. Lee ate with great satisfaction. Aunt May watched, quietly from a distance with a faint smile on her face. Mrs. Lee wiped her mouth contentedly. Then, her husband called, having broken his leg outside, and suddenly remembered he had a wife. When Mrs. Lee returned home, she groomed herself and her delicate skin caught her husband's attention, even ignoring his leg injury, and wanting to forcibly spend time with her. After his leg healed, Mr. Lee couldn't take his eyes off his beautiful wife even for 1 second. Mrs. Lee finally felt the beauty of spring and not only regained her family, but also became the focus of discussion among her friends. Everyone was secretly speculating on what she had eaten or if she had raised a little devil from Thailand. The more outrageous the friends' comments, the happier Mrs. Lee was, because it meant she had truly returned to her youth. Mrs. Lee proudly sat in the middle of her friends, but suddenly everyone smelled a foul odor, thinking it was the meat that had gone bad. Mrs. Lee was also curious, but her hand suddenly touched an itchy swelling on her neck. When she secretly smelled it, she realized it was the foul odor coming from her own body. She hurriedly left the gathering and rushed to the bathhouse. The swelling on her body was getting larger and more obvious, and Mrs. Lee was extremely anxious. She kept adding perfume and flower petals to the water, and angrily called Aunt May to ask what was going on. Aunt May said she had been eating it for over 20 years without any problems, and advised her not to worry. The smell was just a side effect of the medicine. Little did they know that Mr. Lee had overheard everything. He had been looking for a way to rejuvenate his vitality, and now his wife's body had a miraculous effect. After some consideration, he also drove to find Aunt May. This man had an affair with a 60-year-old woman, but her age did not discourage him. Instead, he surrendered himself to the pleasures of the flesh. She told the man that age is just a number, and that true reality lies in the tactile sensations that one feels. The man found this alluring and thrilling. Meanwhile, shortly after Mr. Lee left, Mrs. Lee came knocking on the door with her head wrapped in a scarf, wanting to know how to get rid of the fishy smell. However, Aunt May did not answer the door this time, and even tore up the large check that Mrs. Lee had given her. She was busy dressing up because she wanted to replace Mrs. Lee as the real wealthy woman. As Mrs. Lee watched her skin becoming more and more malodorous, she realized that she had eaten an illegitimate child, and resented it deeply, which caused her to stink. She had no choice but to seek medical help and take medication constantly. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, a woman brutally murdered her husband. It turned out that on the day of her daughter's miscarriage, she had lost too much blood due to the cruel method of induced labor because the girl was too young, and ultimately passed away. Her mother was filled with regret and felt she had failed her daughter, so she returned home and killed her husband. After the crime, she did not flee, for she only wanted to avenge her daughter. Due to her broken family, she had already lost the courage to live. On the other side, Mrs. Lee visited the hospital every day and accidentally ran into the masseuse in the obstetrics and gynecology department, who was already pregnant. Mrs. Lee was devastated when she went to visit May again, only to find that everything was sealed off. She could only leave in disappointment. She spoke to the massage girl, and understood that the girl was only with her husband for money, so she was willing to pay double the price to have the girl abort the baby. Tempted by the huge check, the massage girl agreed. Mrs. Lee bribed the entire hospital to keep the baby, even though the doctors warned her that it would cause tremendous pain. She didn't care and said that it was just a little more pain. When the massage girl asked why she wanted to keep the baby, Mrs. Lee said coldly, In the end, May returned to her 60-year-old appearance and became a scavenger, living in poverty for the rest of her life because her shop was closed. Mrs. Lee touched the formed baby with enjoyment, raised a kitchen knife towards it, with a fierce expression in her eyes, and the film ended. This tragic film shows the ultimate cruelty of human nature. The era of cannibalism does not change just because people are wealthy. Women can eat baby dumplings for beauty to save their indifferent husbands, and the massage girl can sacrifice her unborn child for money. To make matters more obscene, the film showed the wedding memories of Mrs. Lee in black and white at the end, revealing the innocence of the beginning of this marriage. It is sad that the motive for destroying innocence was to maintain it.